So this story takes us back to the time of the Rebbe Maharash. And on the way to Lubavitch, where the Rebbe Maharash lived, there was a small town. And the Rebbe Maharash, whenever he passed by that town, he never stopped off at the local inn. Rather, he just continued on his way, even though it was an inn owned by Jews. One time, though, he made an exception. And he told his wagon driver, pull up to this local kretschmer, like they'd call it in the old days, the local inn, and I'd like to stop there. So the wagon driver pulls up, and the Rebbe Maharash gets out and walks into the inn. Inside, he finds quite an empty room. Stranger, the only people there are two young children. So he asks the children, kids, where are your parents? And they say, well, they're working. They're going around town, got things to do. So he says, so where's your teacher? So they told him, well, now it's Elul. And seeing it's Elul now, our teacher's on vacation. This is when he takes off. Usually their teacher would come from the town where he lived and stay in their inn and teach the children. So when he had a chance to go back home to his family, he made sure to take advantage of it. So the Rebbe Maharash asks them, tell me, children, what do you learn? So one of them, the older one, says, I learn Chumash. And the young one says, I know how to read Tehillim. So the Rebbe tells them, okay, I'm going to test you. Quick, bring some Tehillims. And the children bring Tehillim. And the Rebbe says, start reading Tehillim. So they start saying Tehillim out loud. And as they're saying it word by word, the Rebbe Maharash begins to say it along with them, word by word, very carefully. Meanwhile, their mother arrives back home, and she sees, very surprised, the Rebbe's carriage, which everyone recognized in the area, was parked outside their house. So she decided to go into the house through the kitchen, not to disturb, and over there she overheard the Rebbe saying Tehillim with her children, and she didn't dare disturb them. As she listened, she felt something was wrong. There was this sadness in the Rebbe's voice. The Rebbe seemed troubled, upset, while he was saying Tehillim. But she didn't know why. But if the Rebbe was sad, she knew something must be wrong. And she broke down into tears. When the Rebbe finished, he closed the Tehillim and stood up to leave. He walked to the door, stopped for a few minutes, standing by the door. The children standing there, not sure, what's the Rebbe doing? Then the Rebbe suddenly turns around and says, children, let's read more Tehillim. So they opened the Tehillim again, and they began reading more and more chapters of Tehillim, until finally the Rebbe said goodbye, got into his carriage, and told the wagon driver, back to Lubavitch we go. This situation left the mother very, very surprised, and she waited very, very worried for her husband to come home so she could tell him all about it and try to figure out why the Rebbe sounded so sad, and why, for the first time ever, the Rebbe decided he has to stop at their house and say Tehillim with the children. So, she's waiting for her husband to come, but he didn't. He was meant to get home on time, but he wasn't home yet. She thought maybe he's held up, because that day he went around to all the neighboring villages and went to the local Russian peasants to collect the money they owed him. They would come to the inn and buy food and drink, and he'd go and collect. Some of them would pay in cash, some of them would pay with the crops of their fields. But that afternoon dragged on, and their father was hours late until night fell, and the wife and children were in a panic. What could be going wrong? At midnight, they heard a sudden rapping on the door, and terrified, the wife ran to the door, looked out, and she sees it's her husband. She opens the door. The husband takes one step inside and collapses on the floor. When he wakes up, she asks, what's going on? And he tells him, let me tell you what happened. It was a miracle. He said, I came around the local villages to collect my debts. And one of these villages, the man I'd done business with for years, he said, look, I don't have money to pay you, but I'll measure out some of the grain I just harvested and pay you with that. But I have to go to the barn. That's where I keep my hay and my straw and my grain. So we went into the barn, and once we got inside, this peasant closed the door, and he told me, Jew, I'm about to kill you. So at first I thought it was a joke. We'd known each other for years, and I tried to laugh it off. But this man was completely serious. When I saw he was serious, I began to beg him, what? You can't do this. I have a wife. I have children. Have some mercy. But this peasant told me, when I make up my mind, I don't change it. And he went to the corner of the barn to get his axe. But his axe was missing. He looked around the barn. The axe was nowhere to be seen. He said, Jew, I'm going to get my axe and then I'm going to kill you. But I'm not going to let you escape. He looked around what he could tie up the Jew with, and he found that there were the reins for his horse were in the corner. They were hanging on a nail in the corner of the barn. So he tied up this Yid by hand and foot and securely tied him, and then he went off to his house, first closing the door behind him and securing it in place with a bolt. A moment later, the peasant's wife, who had been working the fields, opened the door of the barn and saw a Jew tied up in ropes. He said, please help me. I have a wife, I have children. Your husband said he's going to kill me. But now this woman was in a very nervous predicament. She said, my husband doesn't make any jokes. If he says he's going to kill you, he's going to kill you. And if he figures out that I freed you, then he'll kill me. But the Jew kept begging and saying, please, you have to save me. And they went on for a few minutes. She said, no, there's nothing I can do for you. And he said, no, you have to save me. And then he said, you know what? If you untie me, then you go back to the fields, I'll run away, and you'll come back to the barn as if you've never seen anything, and your husband won't know anything. So she says, okay. She found the room in her heart. She untied him, and she said, don't run to the highway. If you run away on the highway, that's the first place my husband's going to come look for you. Go hide in the fields. So he ran into the fields and hid in a bundle of straw. A few moments later, he hears the peasant cursing and shouting as he came back to the barn and found that his captive had escaped. He ran straight to the highway. He started running up the road and he didn't see any trace of him. He came back to the field and he shouted, Jew, I'm going to find you. This Yid couldn't even dare to let out a breath. He was terrified. The peasant was standing right next to him, his axe in his hand. And he began in his heart, silently, this Yid began to daven to Hashem. The peasant looked and searched and searched. He stood right next to the Yid who was uncovered by a pile of straw, but he never found him. He marched back to the house, screaming and shouting, but he didn't find the Yid. This Yid stayed under the cover of the hay until nightfall, at which point he silently removed himself and made his way as quickly as he could, as far away from that place as possible, and back home. Now, his wife told him, I don't believe what you just told me. Because today, for the first time ever, the Rebbe visited us. And he said Tehillim with the children. And then, a few minutes later, he came back to say Tehillim again. It must be that the first time he said Tehillim with the children, he was davening for you to be released from being tied up in the barn. And the second time was when you were hiding in the hay in the field with a peasant right next to you. So they saw how the Rebbe had done a miracle and saved them from such terrible tragedy.